September 1176. In the heart of Anatolia, the largest military column Byzantium had assembled in decades advanced along stone roads toward the Seljuk interior. The earth trembled beneath the hooves of thousands of horses. Dust rose in clouds that blotted out the autumn sun. This was no ordinary army. It was the fist of an empire that had governed the Mediterranean world for 800 years, and that had lost in a single afternoon the very heartland of its own territory. And the story most people know about what happened next is wrong. At the vanguard, the heavy cavalry of the Roman army marched with the arrogance of those who know they are invincible. Their armor gleamed, their lances pointed skyward. Behind them, infantry, archers, siege engineers with enormous machines hauled by oxen that could barely move across the broken terrain. A complete war machine. Overwhelming. At the center of it all, Manuel Ferrer Komnenos, Emperor of the Romans, gazed at the horizon with the conviction of a man about to change history. This was the moment, the definitive campaign, the final answer to 100 years of Seljuk humiliation. The objective was Iconium, Konya, the capital of the Sultanate of Rum. Taking it would be a declaration to Christendom, to the Islamic world, and to himself that Byzantium had recovered what it had lost. That the Eastern Mediterranean was Roman once more. That the disaster haunting the nightmares of every emperor since 1071 had finally been reversed. No one in the army seemed to doubt it. Why would they? They had won hard battles. They had subdued ambitious crusaders. They had made Western kings bow before the throne of Constantinople. And now they marched against what was, in theory, a second-rate power, a Turkish sultanate nestled in the mountains of central Anatolia, with no capacity to face Byzantium in open field. Easy prey, or so they thought. Further ahead, beyond the rock-strewn hills, a mountain pass lay in wait. A narrow gorge where the column would be forced to compress, where the heavy cavalry would lose its ability to maneuver, where the siege machines would become iron anchors pinned to the earth. A place where all of Manuel's army's superiority would be neutralized by a single factor that no armor, no organization, no numbers could overcome. The terrain. And someone had been there before them. If this was the most powerful army Byzantium had assembled in generations, why was there never another like it? What happened in that pass will change the way you understand what it means to lose an empire. To understand why Manuel I was so confident, we must step back a century. August 19th, 1071. That day was not simply a lost battle. It was the moment the world changed. Near Manzikert, in eastern Anatolia, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes faced the forces of Alp Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan. The Byzantine army was destroyed. Romanos IV was captured, the emperor himself, taken prisoner by a Turkish chieftain. The news reverberated across the entire Mediterranean world like an earthquake. But what happened next was even more devastating than the battle itself. In the years following Manzikert, as Byzantium plunged into civil wars and political crisis, the Seljuks moved into Anatolia. Not in a single dramatic invasion, but through a gradual, inexorable process. Tribes, settlements, cities falling one by one. Anatolia, which had been the heartland of the Byzantine Empire for centuries, the region that fed its armies and filled its coffers, was being lost. When the Komnenian dynasty seized power in Constantinople, the historical task was clear. Reverse Manzikert. Reclaim Anatolia. Restore to the empire the strategic depth without which its survival was a question of when, not if. Manuel Ferrer Komnenos had inherited that burden while still young. He had spent decades fighting to reconstitute imperial power, campaigns in the Balkans, negotiations with crusaders, constant war on the frontiers. And Anatolia remained there, always to the east, always partially lost, always an open wound in the imperial conscience. In 1176, Manuel was 51 years old. He had reigned for more than 30 years. The strategic window he now saw, a seemingly weakened Sultanate of Rum, a reorganized Byzantium, the opportunity for a decisive blow, would not stay open forever. It was now or never. And while Manuel prepared the largest army the empire had assembled in decades, someone on the other side of the mountains already knew exactly where he would pass, and had prepared something that appeared on no Byzantine map. The pressure came not only from history, it came from internal rivals, from Western allies who questioned imperial capability, from enemies awaiting any sign of weakness. A decisive victory over the Seljuks would be not merely strategic, it would be political, psychological, symbolic. It would be proof that Byzantium was still what it claimed to be. The objective was not just Iconium, it was the empire's own narrative. Manuel had devoted his entire life to the argument that the Eastern Roman Empire was the legitimate and indestructible heir of Rome. Every campaign, every diplomatic agreement, every court ritual in Constantinople reinforced that claim. The defeat at Manzikert had placed an enormous question mark over that narrative, and Manuel had spent his life trying to turn it into a period. This campaign would be that period. But there was something Manuel did not know about the road ahead of him. There was something no one in his army knew. While the marching columns crossed rivers and climbed hills, while officers studied maps and priests said mass at dawn, on the other side of the mountains, someone was watching them. Someone who had spent months planning exactly what to do with that army when it arrived. And that someone had begun preparations long before Manuel first left Constantinople. Manuel Verus Komnenos was a real general, not the kind of emperor who watched battles from a safe hilltop. He fought on the front line, made quick decisions under pressure, had survived situations where weaker men would have retreated. His military record was solid. He had led successful campaigns in the Balkans, had confronted the Crusaders when necessary, had maintained the coherence of an empire that, at any moment, might disintegrate under the weight of its own internal problems. He was charismatic, cultured, and held the conviction that Byzantium's technical and organizational power was superior to that of its enemies. That conviction was, in equal measure, his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. Because Manuel believed that wars were decided in open battle, and there were reasons to believe that. The Byzantine army of 1176 was superior in armament, in discipline, in siege capability, heavy infantry, cataphractos cavalry, sophisticated war machines that the Seljuks simply could not match on open ground. The problem was that open ground was not where the battle would take place. On the other side of the mountains, a man had reached that conclusion long before Manuel I left Constantinople. Kili Arslan II, Sultan of Rum, was not the kind of enemy Manuel had planned to face. A politician as skilled as he was a general. He had risen to power by navigating Seljuk tribal rivalries, survived wars against powerful neighbors, and learned a fundamental lesson that few leaders of his era understood so clearly. You do not defeat a superior army by fighting it on its own terms. You destroy it by changing the rules of the game. Kili Arslan knew that his mounted warriors, his horse archers, were devastating under certain conditions and vulnerable under others. In open ground, Turkish archers could bleed an army with hit-and-run tactics. Strike, withdraw, strike again. But they could not destroy organized heavy cavalry. Manuel's army, on favorable terrain, would likely win a pitched battle. So Kili Arslan simply would not fight on favorable terrain. But there was a problem. How do you convince Manuel to march into the right terrain? This is where the story gets interesting. In the same year as the campaign, 1176, Kili Arslan had negotiated a peace treaty with Manuel. Terms were agreed upon. The tension was formally resolved. Byzantine diplomats returned to Constantinople with the impression that the Seljuk question had been managed. So why was the largest Byzantine army in decades marching toward Seljuk territory if peace had been agreed upon? There are different interpretations. Some historians argue that Manuel distrusted the terms and wanted to press for a stronger position. Others suggest the treaty was viewed in Constantinople as a tactical pause, not a permanent resolution. What is clear is that Manuel decided to advance, and that Kili Arslan had been expecting exactly that. Because the peace treaty had not been a political concession. It had been bait. While Seljuk diplomats smiled in Constantinople, while terms were copied onto parchment and sealed with wax, Seljuk scouts were in the mountains, mapping routes, identifying choke points, selecting the exact location where a marching army would be most vulnerable. The peace was the cover. The trap was being built. The secret lies in that pass, in the stones of that ancient land, in the heights that surrounded that valley, and in something so precise that the Byzantines never saw it coming. This is the story of how the terrain itself, became the weapon that destroyed an empire's hope. The pass of Myriokephalon, a gorge in the mountains of southwestern Anatolia, west of Iconium, was not an obvious choice on the map. It was one of several possible routes the army of Manuel could take toward Konya, but it had specific characteristics that made it perfect for what Kili Arslan had in mind. Narrow gorge, high flanks, rocky terrain that restricted the lateral movement of heavy cavalry. A route long enough to split a large column into vulnerable segments. The question was how to ensure that Manuel would choose that route. That required intelligence. And Kilij Arslan had intelligence. The Seljuk intelligence network was one of the Sultanate's least celebrated aspects, but one of its most effective. Merchants who traveled between territories, nomads who knew every trail on the Anatolian plateau, local guides familiar with the mandatory passage points, all were potential sources. And the logistical characteristics of Manuel's army made reconnaissance relatively straightforward. An army like that could not take just any path. The heavy siege engines, the numerous infantry, they needed roads wide enough for the machines, water supply, routes that did not demand impossible climbs. Myriokephalon lay on the natural path. It was almost inevitable that Manuel would pass through it. Weeks in advance, the Seljuks began working on the pass. Archers were positioned at the heights of the flanks, not in obvious fixed positions, but in stone overhangs, in folds of terrain that made them invisible from below. The disadvantage of shooting from above was that the angles became difficult for targets close to the canyon walls. The advantage was overwhelming. The army below had room to move in only two directions, forward or back. But there was more than archers on the flanks. The second layer of the trap was positioned beyond the pass, at the exit. If the vanguard managed to break through the initial fire and emerge on the other side, they would not find open ground. They would find a second line of Seljuk warriors waiting. And there was a third layer, the most terrifying of all. At the entrance to the pass, positions had been prepared to intercept any unit that tried to retreat once the attack began. Panic in combat drives men in the direction opposite to immediate danger. And Kili Arslan had planned exactly for where that panic would take them. The most devastating secret of the trap was not the fire from the flanks. It was the sequence. The vanguard would enter the pass. The Seljuks would let it through. This required extraordinary discipline, letting the vanguard cross the most dangerous point without firing a single arrow, when their warriors could see the enemy knights less than 50 meters away, when every instinct screamed to attack. Kili Arslan had trained his commanders to resist that impulse. Because the objective was not to destroy the vanguard. The objective was to encircle the main body. Once the vanguard had passed and the central body of the army was inside the pass, the heavy cavalry, the infantry, the siege engines, the signal would be given. The archers on the flanks would open fire simultaneously from both sides. The unit marching at the rear would be intercepted before entering. The vanguard, now on the other side, would face the second line. Manuel's column would be split into three pieces, each piece trapped, separated, unable to support the others. This was not a battle. It was surgery. And there was something that made it even more remarkable. All of this had been planned and executed while Kilij Arslan smiled at Manuel's diplomats and signed peace treaties. The trap had been ready for weeks before the first Byzantine soldier caught sight of the mountains of Myriokephalon. There were warnings. This is the detail that most unsettles anyone who studies Myriokephalon closely. Manuel's army did not enter the pass in the dark. Information was available. There were voices saying that road was dangerous. Forward scouts reported the nature of the terrain. The gorge was too narrow for the army to maintain battle formation. The flanks were too high to be effectively protected. If Seljuk forces were positioned on the heights, the pass would be a death trap. Some advisors urged that the column bypass the passage entirely. Alternative routes existed, longer, more logistically demanding, but free of that flanking vulnerability. Manuel listened, and ordered the advance. To Manuel, the warning sounded like timidity. He had fought in difficult terrain before. His superiority in arms and organization had always compensated for tactical disadvantages. His heavy cavalry could hold any situation. And there was the pressure of time. The army had been marching for weeks. Supply lines were stretched, and turning back would be read politically as hesitation. Exactly what he could not afford to show at a moment when he needed a decisive victory to justify the entire campaign. So he advanced. The Byzantine column entered the pass of Myriokephalon. What the soldiers saw was a stone path climbing between rocky walls, thorny shrubs on the slopes, shadows in the crevices above, silence, broken only by the creaking of the siege engine wheels and the clatter of horseshoes on stone. What they did not see were the Seljuk archers lying still in their covered positions, watching the column pass beneath them. Warriors who had slept there for nights, who had memorized every stone of every position, who waited for the signal with the discipline of men who understood that patience was the deadliest weapon in that moment. What they did not see was the second line, beyond the exit of the pass, where cavalry waited to receive any unit that managed to break through the initial fire. What they did not see was the unit positioned at the entrance, the one that would close the door once the last soldiers had gone through. The vanguard, the foremost knights, passed through the narrowest point of the pass with nothing happening. Not an arrow, no movement on the flanks. Silence. That silence should have been the clearest warning of all, because it meant the Seljuks were up there, and they were waiting. And in that moment, the secret that Kili Arslan had kept for months, buried in the stones of that pass, built through patient reconnaissance and impossible discipline, was about to reveal itself at the highest price imaginable. It was September 17th, 1176. The signal was given when the central body of the army was inside the pass. It is not clear what form the signal took. Possibly a trumpet, possibly a shout, possibly the simple act of a Seljuk commander lowering his hand. What we know is that it happened almost simultaneously on both flanks. From the heights to the left and right, a cloud of arrows descended upon the Byzantine soldiers. There was nowhere to go. This is the physical reality that any analysis of Myriokephalon must emphasize. A man in open field, taking fire from archers, has options. He can advance, retreat, move laterally out of the line of fire. Inside the gorge, there were only two possible movements, forward or backward, and both were being actively blocked. The heavy cavalry, the most powerful element of the Byzantine army, was useless in that space. For heavy cavalry to maneuver, it needs room. The gorge of Myriokephalon had no room. The knights, in their plate and chain armor, became static targets for archers firing from above. The siege engines, those meant to demolish the walls of Iconium, were blocking the way. A wooden assault wagon stuck in the narrow terrain had become an accidental barricade. The column stopped advancing not by choice, but by physical impossibility. Chaos set in. At the rear, units still trying to enter the gorge were intercepted by Seljuk forces positioned at the entrance. What for those units was the path forward had become a second line of combat. Some fell back, others pushed inward, colliding with the column already compressing in the narrow passage. At the vanguard, the one that had passed through unscathed, now on the other side of the gorge, a choice had to be made. Turning back to help the central body meant re-entering the gorge, against the current of panicking troops, without knowing exactly where the Seljuks were positioned inside. An extraordinarily difficult cavalry maneuver, fraught with enormous risk. Advancing meant facing the second Seljuk line waiting beyond the exit. The vanguard hesitated, and that hesitation was decisive. Because while they hesitated, the trap kept tightening. The archers on the heights did not need to be precise. They needed to be persistent. A steady rain of arrows over a mass of men and horses compressed in a narrow space, with no possibility of an effective shield wall, no cover, no firing angle to retaliate against elevated positions, was a sentence of slow bleeding. Horses fell. Knights fell with them, or were left on foot, their armor too heavy for fast infantry combat. The siege engines were abandoned. Some units tried to scale the flanks to reach the archers, and were met by Seljuk warriors in positions they had already chosen for close combat. Then came the revelation that chilled the blood of the survivors. The soldiers fleeing the initial fire, those trying to fall back through the gorge's entrance, found not an exit, but a third line of Seljuk warriors blocking the way. The trap had a second jaw, and a third. There was no way out. Manuel's column had been cut into pieces, and each piece was being pressed from multiple directions simultaneously. Unit cohesion, that organizational quality which had been the strength of the Byzantine army, was disintegrating in the chaos of the gorge. But this is where the history takes a turn that Kilij Arslan had not fully anticipated. The Byzantines began to fight back, not with organized formations, not with the disciplined structure of an army in open field, but with the desperate ferocity of men who knew that dying in retreat and dying in advance were the same thing, and that the only chance they had was to bleed the enemy until he stopped pressing. And that is exactly what they did. There is a misconception about ambush battles that popular fiction perpetuates, that a surprised and cornered force inevitably collapses. That panic replaces combat. That individual survival instinct overcomes collective cohesion. That the outcome is decided the moment the trap closes. The gorge of Myriokephalon was about to become one of the bloodiest places in Anatolia that century. Not because the trap had failed, but because the prey refused to die in the right way. The Byzantine soldiers inside the gorge were, for the most part, professionals. Some were veterans of decades of campaigning. The heavy infantry, those thrown into the gorge with no possibility of cavalry formation, had shields, had training in close combat, had the capacity to organize into small groups even when the larger command structure had been shattered by chaos. When the Seljuk warriors descended from their elevated positions to close the siege and finish the work with hand-to-hand combat, they did not find a fleeing mass. They found men who had decided to make every meter of the gorge cost dearly. The historical accounts of Myriokephalon are fragmented. Most come from Byzantine sources, with reason to emphasize heroism in the face of defeat, and from Islamic sources with reason to downplay the cost of victory. But on both sides of the historiography, one fact emerges with consistency. The Seljuk casualties were significant. Not some acceptable losses. Not the normal cost of a victory. Seljuk units were destroyed in close combat near the pass by Byzantine soldiers who had already lost any hope of strategic victory and had transformed the battle itself into something different. A demonstration that the so-called easy prey would cost dearly for anyone who tried to devour it. The heavy cavalry that had lost its maneuverability advantage on the narrow terrain discovered something else. In one-on-one combat, in spaces where no one could flank or encircle, individual weapon superiority mattered again. A Byzantine cataphractos, in close combat, was a formidable opponent. Several together, covering one another on narrow terrain, could hold a passage, and that is exactly what some units did. The combat in the pass of Myriokephalon lasted hours, not the few minutes a perfect ambush should take to conclude. Hours of brutal fighting, of Seljuk archers exhausting their arrows while warriors below refused to fall in the expected numbers. At some point during that day, the exact account is uncertain, Kilij Arslan received news he had not planned for. His losses were so severe that pressing the attack through to the annihilation of the Byzantine army would cost more than the Sultanate could absorb in the short term. The Sultan who had built the perfect trap, who had caught the largest Byzantine army in decades by surprise, who had that army cornered and bleeding on the very terrain he had chosen, Kilij Arslan stopped pressing and sent messengers to Manuel I with an offer of peace. There is something profoundly revealing in that moment. A commander who had spent months preparing for this battle, who had executed the intelligence operation and positioning with surgical precision, chose to offer terms instead of annihilation, not because he was merciful, but because his own commanders were reporting casualties that would need time to absorb. The easy prey had fought in a way that was not in the plan. Kilij Arslan had won what he wanted strategically, an end to the threat of Byzantine invasion, the destruction of Manuel's offensive capacity in Anatolia. He had no need for extermination if the losses required to achieve it were prohibitive. Kilij Arslan had discovered, inside that pass, that destroying this army would cost more than he had calculated. Manuel the Worn received Kili Arslan's messengers amid what remained of his headquarters within the chaos of the pass. The proposal was relatively concrete. The Byzantines would be allowed to withdraw. In exchange, they would demolish the fortresses they had built along their advance, Doralayan and Sublayan, positions that had served as staging points for the campaign. The siege engines, which were in any case trapped or destroyed in the pass, would be formally abandoned. No demand for mass captives, no territorial demands beyond the fortresses. For a sultan who had just executed the most successful ambush of the era in Anatolia, the terms were remarkably moderate. Why? The answer lies in the casualties. Kili Arslan had won the strategic battle. He had destroyed Byzantine offensive capacity in Anatolia for a generation, but paying the cost of completely annihilating an army that still fought with that intensity would mean spending months reorganizing his own forces. And there were other political pressures bearing down on the Sultanate that could not wait. The moderation of the terms was the most honest measure of the Seljuk losses. Manuel accepted. He had no real choice. The army that had marched with such confidence in September had been broken as an instrument of invasion. The fortresses would be demolished. The siege engines would be abandoned. The campaign that was meant to finally settle the Seljuk question had ended in a treaty signed in the shadow of a pass covered in the dead. The march back to Constantinople was nothing like the march forward. Manuel I, who had spent decades cultivating the image of an invincible emperor, had to return to his capital in defeat. There were ways to minimize it, and the court chroniclers tried. The official narrative emphasized the heroic resistance, the moderation of the terms, the fact that the army had withdrawn and not been annihilated. But Manuel I himself wrote something different. In a letter to Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Manuel compared Myriokephalon to the Battle of Manzikert, that disaster of 1071 which had haunted Byzantine strategy for more than a century. The emperor who had marched to reverse Manzikert had arrived, in his own words, at the conclusion that he had created a second one. The court of Constantinople absorbed the blow in silence. There was no mutiny, no immediate overthrow. Manuel would continue to reign until 1180. But something had shifted in the political calculus of the empire. The idea of a great campaign of reconquest in Anatolia was dead. The political and military cost of trying again was unthinkable. The dream that had driven 3 generations of Komnenian emperors to reverse Manzikert, to recover Anatolia, had died in the pass of Myriokephalon. Manuel compared Myriokephalon to Manzikert. The comparison was honest but incomplete. Manzikert had been a shock. Myriokephalon was a sentence. After 1176, the balance of power in Anatolia was fixed. The Seljuks controlled the interior. The Byzantines held the coast, but had lost the offensive capacity to change that. And without the Anatolian interior, the empire was vulnerable in a way no policy could correct. The Anatolian interior would remain under Turkish rule, preparing the ground for the transformations that would shape the region in the centuries to come. Manuel died in 1180, 4 years after Myriokephalon. What followed was an acceleration of decline, succession crisis, weakening frontiers, and eventually the catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, which would destroy Constantinople from within. None of this was caused by Myriokephalon alone. But Myriokephalon closed the door that might have prevented some of it. Manzikert gets the attention. It is the name historians cite as the turning point of Byzantine history in Anatolia. And there are reasons for that. It was dramatic. It was the emperor captured. It was the moment the Seljuk Turks proved they could defeat Byzantium in open battle. But Manzikert left the question open. Anatolia was lost, but perhaps not forever. Myriokephalon closed that question. The tactical lesson is clear as stone. The Battle of Myriokephalon was decided months before it began. Not on the field. On the map. At the negotiating table. In the quiet planning of a man who understood that the real battlefield was not where the enemy planned to fight. It was where he would make him fight. And the Byzantine response, that ferocity inside the pass, that pushback that forced Kili Arslan to offer terms instead of annihilation, is the other half of the lesson. Armies are not merely machines of war. They are men with institutional memory, with training, with the capacity to adapt when the situation collapses around them. The Byzantine army of 1176 was destroyed as an instrument of conquest, but as an instrument of resistance, it cost the victor more than the victor had planned to pay. Those who thought the Greeks were easy prey discovered, deep inside that pass, that the prey had teeth. In September 1176, Manuel Fert left Constantinople certain he was going to reverse a century of history. Instead, he wrote the end of a chapter that would never be reopened. If you've made it this far, you already know that the most decisive battles are rarely the most famous. There is another one of those battles waiting, one where the trap was even more invisible, where the winner was not the one with the largest army, but the one who made the enemy choose the wrong field, for the wrong reason, at the wrong moment. That is the kind of story we explore here, every week. Subscribe, and the next trap will be waiting for you.